Pot roast is a hearty Midwestern classic for a good reason. It's rich, it's filling, and it's flavorful. And when you cook it with sous vide, it's going to be one of the best pot roasts you've ever had. We're going to dive into everything you need to know coming up next. Hey there, I'm Jason Logston from Amazing Food Made Easy and president of the International Sous Vide Association. And today I'm excited to be talking to you about making sous vide pot roast. Sounds a little counterintuitive because we always think about cooking perfectly cooked steaks using sous vide. But cooking to a little bit higher temperature for something like pot roast or any of these braise-like dishes is actually a really big strength of sous vide. And that's because you can set it for the specific doneness that you want. This allows you to completely control the texture of the dish and the juiciness of the final dish, which really improves the results. So to me, that answers the question, why would you use sous vide for a pot roast? Because it's going to be more juicy, more tender than most traditional methods. I think pot roast is one of the perfect dishes to use sous vide for. First, what do we mean by pot roast? It's kind of a loaded term. Some people think it's a cut because grocery stores will label meat as a pot roast, but it's really more of a preparation method, and that's how I'm going to be using it. To me, a pot roast is any sort of fatty beef cut that's cooked to a braise-like temperature. Anything that's about 150 or above, where you start breaking down those connective tissues. And traditionally, it'd be either braised in something like a Dutch oven, a pot in the stove. People can use crock pots to do braising. There's a lot of different ways to accomplish a braise, but to me, sous vide is the perfect technique for getting that braise-like texture that you really want consistently every single time. So there's a lot of different cuts that you can use for a pot roast. Like I said, many grocery stores will label it pot roast, but normally chuck steak is kind of the go-to for a lot of people because it's fatty, it's really flavorful, has a lot of connective tissue that will break down over time. And you need that connective tissue. If you try to cook a pot roast using a filet mignon, it's going to be tough and just really, really dry because there's nothing in there to break down and separate. And that's the key to a good pot roast, is being able to separate those protein in the beef. So chuck roast is a classic pot roast cut. It's something that I use all the time. There's also brisket is a good one because it's, again, fatty. It has a lot of connective tissue in it. Some people like using rump roasts. Bottom rounds are pretty popular. Some people like using eye of round or top round, but I think they're a little too lean for a really good pot roast, but some people like them. I usually stick to chuck roast or something like even beef short ribs that work really well for this almost shreddable, falling off the bone texture that I really like. The other benefit to using sous vide for a pot roast is because you can break it down as much as you want. You can tenderize it at any temperature. So any of these cuts we're talking about, you could do a sous vide beef roast, sous vide roast beef with them. That's something that I talk about in another article, and that's when you're cooking it down at like 130, 140 degrees, and it's coming out steak-like. A lot of those same cuts, like the chuck, you can cook at a higher temperature, and then it turns into a pot roast, and it's braise-like. And that's one of the benefits to using sous vide, because you can do any texture along that entire line. So what is the best time and temperature for sous vide pot roast? There's no one specific correct time, but what I really like, to me, is one of the perfect braise-like textures is at 150, 152. That's where I do a lot of my pot roasts. That's because at 154, you start to squeeze out a lot more juice as the proteins really change. At 150, 152, you start breaking down the connective tissue and the fat, but you're not really changing the protein structure that much, so it retains a lot more juice. Once you go above 154, you lose about another 20-30% of the weight of the steak in juice. So I try to keep it down below there. It's not going to be falling apart. It's not going to be shreddable, but it has much more of a pot roast kind of texture, braise-like texture to it than something that's at like 140 where it's obviously a steak. For timing, it really comes down to what cut of meat are you using. Like I said, chuck roast is a very classic pot roast cut, and for that, I usually go 36 hours. But 1 to 2 days is the sweet spot, depending on where you get your meat from and how broken down you want it. But for me, 24 to 36 hours is a really good time at 152. So that works well for me for sous vide chuck roast. But if I want to use brisket, it can be a little bit longer. Short ribs can be even longer than that, up to 2 or 3 days sometimes. But usually 1 to 2 days is a good rule of thumb that works well for most tough cuts when you're going for braise. As I said, 152 is my ideal temperature that I use, but you can also raise that temperature if you want it to be a more traditional texture. 165 is a traditional braise to me. It's really starting to fall apart. You can, eat it with a fork, as they say. When you dive into it, it's going to come apart and it's going to flake pretty well. But it still has structure, it still has bite, but you have lost a lot more of those juices. But it's very traditional braise-like pot roast. If you want it to be really falling apart, if that's your jam, then go up to 176. You don't have to cook it as long. It knocks about 30 to 50% off the cook times, and it's really going to be broken down at that point. Shreddable almost if you wanted to make shredded beef or pork relays. That's a good temperature for those. But at 176, you are really breaking down everything. You're squeezing out those juices. You're going to want to serve it with a flavorful sauce, and it's going to be really similar to a traditional braised dish. As I said, my favorite sous vide pot roast time and temperature is 152 for 36 hours using a chuck roast. To me, that's just perfect. I love it. So now we know a little bit about why you would sous vide pot roast and the time and temperature I like. Let's take a look at the specific process for accomplishing it. Now, to help with this, I'm going to link up my favorite simple sous vide pot roast master recipe. It makes it easy to make a perfectly cooked pot roast that you can serve with any of the sides and accompaniments that you would normally do it. I love mashed potatoes and some roasted vegetables with my pot roast, but there's a lot of different ways to take it that we'll talk about later. But using this simple master recipe, you can turn out amazingly perfectly cooked meat every single time. Regardless of the time and temperature, the process is generally the same. So let's dive into that. The first step is to remove it from the store packaging. Some people like to leave it in the package and cook it. I always try to take it out because you want to remove some of the fat and connective tissue. When you're using a braise-like temperature, it's going to break down more than if you're doing a steak. So you can leave some more on because the sous vide process will render some of that fat out and will break it down at the temperatures we're using. But you want to remove any gristle or big hunks of fat. Some people like to sous vide the pot roast whole. I usually break it down. It makes it easier to get in the sous vide machine. And I'm not going to be serving the entire pot roast at the table generally. So I can always reassemble the pieces if I do want it in a fancy Dutch oven or something on the table. So I either cut it into individual serving portions or 2 to 3 inch slabs that are easier to seal, easier to season. And then if you want to get a sear on the sides, you can do that as well. Once you have it portioned, some people really like to pre-sear their meat. If you're doing a pot roast or something that's a longer cooking item, sometimes people like to pre-sear it to get a really hard crust on it that's going to add a little bit of flavor into the bag while you're sous videing it. I almost never pre-sear, but the one time that I do is when I'm doing something like a pot roast, I'll consider it. And I do it about 50-50. It does add a little more flavor, a little more texture, but it's also an extra step, which I don't always have time for. But if you want to get more of that traditional crust, it's not a bad idea to pre-sear it before you season and bag it. But if you are going to pre-sear and you have a vacuum sealer, make sure that you chill the meat before you seal it. Otherwise, during the vacuum process, you're going to be pulling a lot of moisture out from the meat. It's going to dry it out and it's not going to be nearly as tender and flavorful as it could be. When you're ready to bag it, I always salt my meat. Some people don't, but I think it adds a little bit of flavor and a little bit of a good texture to it. You can also use any spice rubs, any garlic powder, onion powder. I like to use some fresh herbs like rosemary, thyme, sage. Some people only want to do salt and they don't like the rubs. I like experimenting with some different flavors, and it adds some good flavor to the outside of the meat, which I really enjoy. I save black pepper until the end of the sous vide process, and normally after I sear it, that's when I'll add it fresh cracked at the table. And I also don't recommend putting too much butter or oil into the bag. When you're cooking steaks, you don't want to add any fat to the bag because it does pull out some of the flavor. But with most braised dishes, you are going to be using the juices that come out of the bag, so it's okay to have a little bit in there. But if you're not going to be making a gravy or a sauce from the juices, then you probably want to leave the fat out as well. Once it's seasoned, you can put it in a sous vide bag and seal it. Any food heat-safe bag will work well. When you're doing higher temperatures, though, and longer cook times, some of these could be 176 for 12 or 24 hours, you can run into trouble with Ziploc bags. So you probably want to double bag if you are using those. An edge sealer like a food saver works great. A chambered vacuum sealer works really well for these longer cooks. And one of the things that I used to do was, before I had a chambered vacuum sealer, because their bags are higher quality, I would still use the water displacement method with chambered vacuum sealer bags. They're less expensive in a lot of cases than Ziplocs, and you can just drape the top of the bag over the outside of the sous vide container, and the water displacement method will shove out all the air, and you have a higher quality bag that's not going to leak during these long, higher temperature cook times. Remember, if you did cut up your meat, you want to put it in a single layer in the bag. And once you start stacking it, you're increasing the thickness and you're increasing cook times, and it's not going to cook as evenly. So in all sous vide cooks, pretty much all, you want to leave it in a single layer, so that way everything's going to heat through evenly. Next, you just want to prepare the water bath. You just need to fill a container with water. This could be a stock pot, a polycarbonate container, which basically means fancy plastic, a Lapavi, Cambro, Rubbermaid, all make really good versions of that. And some people like to use coolers because it does retain heat very, very well. Just want to set your sous vide machine to the temperature you decided. Like I said, 152 is my preferred pot roast temperature, but a lot of people do like 165 or even 176 to get that even more tender texture. But whatever your desired doneness is, set your machine to that, then put the bag in the water and let it cook. When you put in the water, make sure that all of the meat is below the water line. Especially for these longer cooks, it's unsafe if any of the meat is sticking out. You want it to cook evenly, and if things are sticking out, then they're going to be really fostering bacteria, and that is not a good thing. You don't want to make your friends and family sick when you're cooking a family-style meal like a pot roast. I like to use sous vide magnets to hold the bag under the water. That helps a lot and makes it a very easy process to make sure that the food is going to remain safe. Once it's cooked for the 1 day, 2 days, however long you wanted to cook it at the braise-like temperature for, you want to take it out of the water bath. Now there's two schools of thought when it comes to braise. The first is you should just eat the braise when it's hot and fresh and ready to go. And the second school is all braises are better if you cool them for at least overnight and reheat them the next day. So depending on what your school of thought is on braises, I think they both work really well. At this point, you can cool it in a cold water or ice bath, get that core temperature down as quickly as possible. Then you can store it in the fridge overnight or even up to a week or two to reheat at a later time. When you reheat it, I like to just put it back in the sous vide machine at a lower temperature, maybe like 130, and you're going to bring it up so it's nice and hot, but you're not in any danger of overcooking it. And a lot of braises are served in a sauce, and if that's the case, if you reheat it to 130, you're not going to overcook it when you put it in the hot sauce. When you're ready to eat, you want to take it out of the bag, and then you can sear it if it's the type of braise-like dish that you want to sear, or you can just serve it as is. A lot comes down to what the dish is. If you're doing a thick piece of meat on top of some mashed potatoes in a more refined style, you're going to take it out of the bag, dry it off really well with paper towels or dishcloths, and give it a sear in a cast iron pan or a hot skillet over high heat to get a nice crust on the outside of it. If you're serving it covered in gravy, then that crust might not matter nearly as much, and you can just chop it up or dice it out of the bag and you're good to go. So it really depends what your final dish preparation is, whether or not you need to sear it. Once you put that optional sear on it, it is ready to serve. Another way that works really well for finishing off a braise-like pot roast is to finish it in the oven. You can put it in a broiler pan, put it under the broiler, and give it a crust on the outside. And if you did just reheat it to 130, you have a lot of leeway to give a good crust on the outside while still keeping that core temperature below the 150 mark that you cooked it at originally. And that's key. When you're searing it, you don't want to bring that temperature up above where it was. Otherwise, you undo all that sous vide work that you did. So using the broiler is a great way to put a sear on it, especially when there's more a hole or jagged, outside to it. If you've cut it into 2 to 3 inch slabs, then they're normally pretty uniform and it's easy to sear on a cast iron pan. But that crust will give additional flavor, and it obviously helps with the appearance of the meat if you're serving it when it's not slathered in gravy or in a nice sauce. Now that it's seared and it's ready to go, you can now serve it with any of your favorite pot roast sides. Some of my favorites, as I said, are mashed potatoes and roasted vegetables. You can put together the juices in the bag to make a really nice homemade gravy. You can use an au jus just on the side to dip it in. Red wine sauce is a classic pot roast accompaniment. You can use a rosemary butter sauce. You can just slice it thinly for French dip sandwiches. There's a lot of ways that you can use a pot roast. But now you know the perfect way to cook your pot roast every time. You can use whatever your favorite pot roast recipes were that you grew up as a kid eating amazing home-style pot roast, but now you can make it the sous vide pot roast so the meat is perfectly cooked, perfectly tender, and exactly the way that you want it every single time. If you have any comments, please drop them below. And for people that are just getting started, I always recommend my free sous vide quick start course. It's at afmeasy.com/quickstart. And I also do a lot of work with the International Sous Vide Association, including free showcases, demos, and cook-alongs at the isva.org. Till next time, I'm Jason Logston.